Good afternoon. I'm Gerald Hale, the Dean of the College of Arts, Sciences, and Letters at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. On behalf of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, the College of Arts, Sciences, and Letters, and the University of Michigan-Dearborn, I'm pleased to welcome those of you in attendance and those of you watching the stream of this event to locations around the country and around the world. The 2012 presidential election will have profound implications for both U.S. foreign and domestic policies, especially as those policies impact emerging communities in this country. The University of Michigan-Dearborn is an intellectual community that prides itself on community outreach and having a significant impact that is local, regional, national, and international. We pride ourselves on a commitment to diversity, inclusion, and on being a home for students from many of the emerging communities that will likely be influenced by the presidential election and on the outcome and result of that election. That's why we're pleased to co-sponsor this event with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, an organization with a long history in the Detroit metropolitan area and in the United States for promoting understanding of social policies and issues confronting Arab Americans and other emerging communities. We are pleased to have them as partners for this event and thank them for reaching out to us to extend the offer of a partnership. Again, thank you for joining us. Welcome to campus, whether in person or remotely. You're in for an afternoon of engaging and lively discussion and dialogue. I'll kick off the first of two panels this afternoon by introducing its moderator, Dr. Ronald Stockton. Dr. Stockton is Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. He is one of the nation's preeminent scholars whose work examines the intersection of politics and the Arab American experience. Among other notable publications, he's co-author of the 2009 book, Citizenship and Crisis, Arab Americans in the Aftermath of September 11. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stockton.
This is the first of two panels. I could talk loud enough, you can hear me, yeah.
For the video, they need that.
Yeah, oh, you need that for the video. Okay, that's fine. This is the first of two panels, and we have two exceptional speakers. The topic is understanding the numbers. What does the research show about the potential impact and role of minorities or otherwise marginalized voters in key elections? What are the trends and attitudes of these groups in Michigan? What issues do these groups care about? My suspicion is that this description is really a kickoff point for the two speakers to say whatever they want. So we're not going to hold them to that. But basically we're interested in engagement of different communities in the political system. And we are really lucky in the two people that we have. Bill Ballinger is, let me just read a couple things, but I'm really going to tell you my experience with him, which I think is better than the description. It says he's a former state representative and state senator. He's served under Gerald Ford in Washington. He's been an adjunct faculty member. Okay, that's all nice in the resume. The fact is, this man knows more about Michigan politics than anybody else around. I've seen him in a couple panels when he's been thrown really bizarre questions, including one by me, and he gave really exceptional answers. So he does Inside Michigan Politics. That's a well-known newsletter for people, and you'll see him on public television most weeks when we're talking about Michigan, and so we're really lucky to have him. We were supposed to have Fareed Senzai on as the second panelist, but he's the director of a major research project on engaging American Muslims. Unfortunately, he had a death in the family, so he is now with his family, and we extend our condolences to him and his family. Fortunately, Shireen Zaman, who's also involved in that project and is the executive director of the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, is substituting for him. So we're going to be in good hands. So I'm going to turn this over. I think first Shireen might go first because she's actually got a study she wants to outline, and then we'll let Bill go and he can use a different approach if that's okay.
Thank you, Professor Stockton and Dean Hale, and all of you for being here and for watching online. My name is Shireen Zaman. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. As was described, we've been here, we were actually founded here in Michigan just over 10 years ago. In fact, this weekend we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary, and so this partnership with the University of Michigan-Dearborn is the first in a sort of a series of events that we're doing. Tomorrow night we have a gala event. You can get information on the table outside. We welcome you all to join us there. So as was mentioned, I'm sort of subbing in for Fareed, who was the primary investigator on the study that we did and released earlier this year. And some of you may have seen the op-ed that was published in the New York Times relating to this study. So I want to just go through a few of the key findings that we had and really some points that I think will help set up the conversation not only for this panel, but even for the next. So just a little bit about the background of this study. As you can imagine, Muslim and Arab communities around the country have experienced increasing profiling and backlash in the aftermath of 9/11. That sort of reaction to the community prompted a greater motivation for political participation, and also an increase in the level of political and community leaders in how to have more effective political outreach efforts. But there was really very little data on sort of the interests of the community, who were the key leaders in the community, and how we could better engage them. And so we with the support of the Proteus Fund, undertook this year-long study really looking at several sort of using different types of methodology. One was really looking at national survey data that had been compiled over this 10-year period. So looking at Pew, the MAPS project, the MAPOS project, and several other national level studies. We also then looked at 2 case studies in key swing states. So those states where, as we know, there are very tight elections in this campaign season. And also where there were significant populations of American Muslims. So the 2 states that we looked at were here in Michigan and Florida. And then we tried to provide recommendations not only for community leaders, but also for those in political parties or political campaigns who really wanted to engage these increasingly important communities. So just a few demographics. Hopefully the chart there is big enough to read, but these are the states really where we have the highest level of American Muslim communities. The Pew study estimated that the total American Muslim population to be about 2.75 million. Now this number is highly contested, but for the purposes of this study, that's the population number that we used. 60% of the Muslim population nationally is between the ages of 18 and 39, in comparison to 40% of the general American public. Over a third of American Muslims were born in the United States. This racially diverse group identified as 30% white, 26% black or African American, 21% Asian, 6% Hispanic, and others of mixed race. About 1 out of every 5 American Muslims is a convert. So as you can see in this chart, there is definitely higher concentrations of Muslims in a few major swing states, like New York and California, and then obviously also a number of swing states as well. So a couple of the key findings that, I guess overall 2 things I would say about that we found in this study. One is American Muslims are very much American. So the trends that we see in American communities or other immigrant communities are very similar to the trends that we see in the American Muslim community. And so some of these will play out in some of the data that I'm going to share with you. So according to the analysis that we did for this study, nearly 70% of American Muslims pay attention to politics most or some of the time. 86% said it's important for them to participate. And in a post-9/11 world, American Muslim, the identity of being an American Muslim has become very important in voting decisions. So in 2004, nearly 70% of American Muslims suggested that being Muslim is important in their decision on who to vote for and how to vote. Among those that are citizens and eligible to vote, American Muslims have some of the highest rates of registration. And I think one of the things we'll talk about later is mobilization. Registration is sometimes the easier thing to do. To actually get people to the poll is sometimes harder. And similar again to the general trends that we see in the American public, voter registration increases with age. With in the Muslim population, registration for those over the age of 55 being the highest at almost 80%. The studies show overwhelmingly that this is a civically engaged community as well. So 97% of all Muslims thought that Muslims should donate to non-Muslim programs like aid for the homeless. 87% thought that Muslims should support worthy non-Muslim political candidates. And there's been a lot of debate about this and sort of a lot of, I think, misleading information, but the studies across the board have shown that higher levels of involvement in mosque-related activities leads to increased participation in American politics. Again, this is something that we see across religious communities, churches, synagogues. Engagement in those types of institutions actually leads to broader political participation. I think another really interesting trend and something that may not seem apparent is that the most common political ideology response across the studies was politically moderate. Although many Muslim Americans had previously identified with the Republican Party, the trend in the community has been to move away from the Republican Party, but not necessarily to become Democrats, but to become independents. And the other interesting finding, I think, is that those with higher degrees of religiosity are far more likely to identify with neither major political party. And there's a note in the study that sort of discusses that this doesn't necessarily mean that they're less civically engaged, but rather that neither party welcomes their religiosity. So again, we did, as part of the report, and I should mention that the report is available, the full report is available on our website, ISPU.org, and you can grab a paper on the way out. Michigan obviously is a swing state with a large Muslim population. I think one of the surveys counted about 80,000 registered Muslim voters. And so there was a couple of just trends that I wanted to highlight here in terms of Muslim voters, particularly in Michigan. So again, as I said, similar to national data, the data suggests that the older the population gets, the more active it tends to be. It also shows that the level of political participation among youth is actually relatively high compared to their peers in other types of demographic groups. So this indicates that the community's younger members understand the overall significance of engaging in politics. So, and then this is also kind of, because a number of our Muslim community members are of immigrant communities, I think another interesting thing to look at is sort of how does that shift as we become as further generations in the Muslim community begin to get more involved in politics. So as we can see here, as people are becoming more quote-unquote American, so as we have more generations of these Muslim communities growing up in this country, you tend to see more acts of political participation. So what the study defines as an act of political participation is something like writing a letter to an elected official, attending a protest or a rally, going to a community meeting, or making a donation to a political party or cause. Again, I mentioned this earlier in terms of political participation by mosque involvement. So again, as people are more involved in their religious communities, we're seeing higher levels of political activity. So we think that there is a lot of, that this study actually shows that there's quite a bit of potential in Michigan, and as we will talk about in the second panel, in other immigrant and minority communities as well. There is a very politically active community, the potential for cultivating voters, really for either party, and potentially a significant voting bloc for candidates in terms of just the diversity of this state. So a few just general conclusions from the study overall. Definitely there seems to be a trend with increased engagement and sophistication, particularly as we have more generations, or the generations become sort of increasingly integrated into the American society. And that the Muslim vote can be a key constituency, especially in certain districts and swing states. So a couple of areas of engagement and opportunity, and I think we'll dive deeper into this more broadly in the second panel. African American Muslims have been among the most highly politically active across the board, and that's also true here in Michigan. Particularly the data in Michigan showed that American Muslim women are far more active than men in this state. So that maybe shatters some of the gender stereotypes that people generally have, but I think it's a great opportunity for engagement in these communities as well. Clearly, because of the opportunity of increased engagement in religious institutions, there's several recommendations around increasing engagement and training, actually, of religious leaders in these efforts. And that there's an opportunity, as we talked about, of having cultivating this largely independent voting bloc. So I will stop there and I guess invite Bill to make a few remarks, and then we'll do Q&A.
Is this okay? Thank you. I'm not sure how long people want me to go on, and what I thought I was supposed to talk about today is so broad and general compared to what you just heard. It's going to be like, you know, the difference between apples and oranges. But maybe I can just throw it into the mix, and then we can get into a question and answer thing back and forth. I passed out some newsletters here. One of them lists the ballot proposals just decided on last week that are going to be on the November 6th ballot. But there's another newsletter I pass out. If you open it up on the inside, there's a chart with all the state representatives and U.S. representatives are going to be on the ballot on November 6th. And I guess what I'd like to do is just kind of, in a broad way, remind you or tell you, maybe if this is the first time you've ever heard it, that in a presidential year, Michigan has the longest ballot of any state in the country. I mean, it is staggering, the number of offices that we have up for grabs in Michigan in a presidential year. It's unbelievable, and it's getting worse. This year will usher in a new high water mark, and it's going to get even more pronounced the next 2 years, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. I'll lead up to that, you know, a little whatever, something to look forward to. But let me just remind you what isn't on the ballot this year. No state senate races this year. None of the constitutional officers in Michigan, like governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, they're not on the ballot this year. But everything else that you can possibly imagine is going to be on the ballot this year. You've got president, you've got U.S. senator, you've got Debbie Stabenow running for her third 6-year term. You've got 14 U.S. representatives going to be elected, down from 15 in the last decade. We can go into details there if you want to. The entire state house is going to be on the ballot, all 110 seats. Not the state senate, but the state house, all 110. You've got all those education boards. You know, Michigan is actually the only state that elects not only its 3 major research university governing boards, University of Michigan, Michigan State University Board of Trustees, Wayne State University Board of Governors, and its State Board of Education. Those 4 panels 8 members on each board, 8-year staggered terms, so every 2 years, 2 members on each one of those boards are up statewide, not by district. None of these people are appointed except if there's a vacancy because of death or resignation. So we're the only state that does that. Here's another big one, Supreme Court. I know you're aware of this. Michigan is also peculiar, very peculiar, in that we nominate our candidates for the Supreme Court at state party conventions, and then they magically divest themselves of their partisan coloration. They kind of drift out of the convention halls like butterflies into the sunlight with their black robes streaming behind them, and they're nonpartisan. So when you go to vote on November 6th, unless you know in advance which one of these candidates were nominated by the Republicans or Democrats, there's no way you can tell from looking at the ballot. And in fact, there are going to be people on the ballot November 6th who were not nominated by either the Republicans or the Democrats. They were nominated by libertarians or natural law or socialist workers, or they're independent or whatever. It's very confusing. And the Supreme Court has 7 members, and right now, shockingly, because I know you think of the Supreme Court as being nonpartisan, it's controlled by the Republicans 4-3. 4-3. 3 of the 7 seats are up this year. So whichever party wins 2 of the 3 seats that are going to be on the ballot November 6th is going to control the court beginning in January of next year for at least the next 2 years. And if one party sweeps all 3 seats, it's going to be 5-2. Whichever party. Doesn't make any difference. And that's very important because in Lansing right now, even though at the federal level no Republican has carried Michigan since 1988, and both our U.S. senators are Democrats, at the state level, it's the other way around. The Republicans control absolutely everything in Lansing. They control governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, state senate, state house, and they control the Supreme Court. So obviously, the Democrats would love to get control of the Supreme Court because that would offer some ability to throw a monkey wrench into the Republican juggernaut up there, which has held sway for the last couple of years. We've got 234 other judges on the ballot on November 6th. Appeals court, district, probate, circuit court, they're all on the ballot beneath the Supreme Court. Then we get down to what might be called the local level. And some of these local offices are pretty big and they have a lot of constituents. County-wide elected officials, your prosecuting attorney, let's say here in Wayne County, sheriff, treasurer, clerk, these people are all on the ballot. There are over 500 of them statewide, 83 counties, think about it. County boards of commissioners, we got 83 counties. We're going to have 622 county commissioners elected this year statewide. Now, they're getting better. It was 699 the last decade, but they cut a number of boards down in size in various counties, like Oakland is going from 25 down to 21, but it's still 622 commissioners we're going to be electing. Now, here's the really big one. Townships. Remember, we got 1,242 townships in Michigan. And most of them have at least 5 board members governing those townships. Supervisor, treasurer, clerk, and 2 trustees. If you're a charter township, you got 4 trustees, so you got 7 members. They're all on the ballot this year for 4-year terms. 5,000 plus township officials being elected in Michigan this year. Now, here's the pièce de résistance that I saved until the end. I titillated you to tell you something new is coming. School board members. Now, you've been electing school board members for years, right? But remember, they were always in those obscure elections in May and June that nobody really knew about until you heard that somebody had been elected, that kind of thing. Then the state legislature decided a few years ago, well, we got to consolidate all our elections in Michigan. We're going to have them either on the last Tuesday in February, first Monday in May, first Monday in August, first Monday in November. Just those 4 dates, that's it. They let the school board members be elected at any of those times for a few years. Then they decided, no, we're going to be even tougher. We're going to be even more organized and concentrated in our elections. And we're going to give even more people a chance to vote for school board members than has existed for 170 years. We're going to put them all in the November general election every 2 years. And that's what they've done. So when you go to vote this November for the first time in history, first time in 170 years, there are going to be 1,052 school board members elected in Michigan around the state. And 2 years from now, over 1,400. Now, everybody's going to say, well, you know, this is wonderful. We get to go in and vote for president while we're there. We can vote for our school board member. We won't have to worry about it any other time. Problem is, you know, school board members have enough trouble getting visibility, I think, even when they had the election, when they were the only race on the ballot in May or June. Now, I don't know how they're going to compete with 10,000 other candidates. They're buried down at the bottom of the ballot. So you can see the kind of vast, confusing melange of candidates, races, and I haven't even mentioned ballot proposals, right? And ballot proposals, we've got 6 ballot proposals. One of these newsletters talks about them. And there can be some local ballot proposals, too. But the big ones, the 6 at the state level that were just decided a week ago, let me just remind you what they are. The first one is emergency financial manager. It's a referendum on a law that was passed 18 months ago. So it's the only one of the 6 that is not a constitutional amendment. A bunch of people got together and said, we don't like this law the legislature passed a year and a half ago, so let's have a referendum on it, meaning all the people in the state get a chance to say, we want to keep this law, or this is a lousy law, let's throw it out. And when those petitions are certified, which they finally were, just about 2 months ago, finally, took forever, took 5 months after the petitions were handed in, the law is stayed. So right now, we have no emergency financial manager law. Public Act 4, that's the one that's been stayed. That's the one the referendum is on. We do still have an emergency financial manager law, but it's the old law. It's called Public Act 72 from 25 years ago. That kicked in when this one was stayed. And that will be the situation until November, and then in November we'll decide, do we want to keep Public Act 4, the new, streamlined, more powerful emergency financial manager, or we want to get rid of it. The second proposal on the ballot is the one you probably heard about, that would pretty much enshrine collective bargaining in the Constitution, kind of guarantee it, and say that any attempt by Michigan to pass a right-to-work law, if you know what that is a non-starter. It's not going to happen. So that's on the ballot. That's number 2. Number 3 is called 25 by 25. You know what that means? 25% of all the energy providers, utilities in Michigan, of their energy portfolio has to come from renewable sources, like wind or solar or whatever, and it has to be done that 25% standard has to be met by the year 2025. So that's why it's called 25 by 25. The number 4 ballot proposal would give collective bargaining and union organizing rights to home health care workers who accept federal funds. This was put on by the Service Employees International Union, so that's another labor-related issue. Number 5 is one that should gladden the hearts of conservatives and small government people, and that is, let's require not just a simple majority but a 2/3 majority of both the House and the Senate in Lansing to hike taxes of any sort at any time. 2/3 majority, very tough to get. In fact, I'm not sure we've ever passed a tax hike in Michigan history with a 2/3 majority. What politician wants to vote to raise taxes? They like to spend money, but they don't like to actually have people see that they're raising taxes to pay for it. So this would be on the ballot on November 6th, make it a 2/3. 7 other states, by the way, including California, have this. And, you know, the people who don't like this will argue there's chaos in those 7 states, like California. So think about that. The 6th proposal is one that I'm sure you've heard something or seen something about, the bridge. There's only one bridge that could be about, right? The international bridge, prospective international bridge that Rick Snyder, the governor, and a lot of people in the business community, and for that matter in organized labor, lots of jobs involved, and the Canadian government want to see built over the Detroit River, in addition to the Ambassador Bridge, which is the only bridge we've got in that location right now, the privately owned bridge by Matty Maroon. Now, Matty Maroon doesn't like the idea of having competition, so he has funded a proposal. It's going to be on the ballot November 6th, which basically says to people, there has to be a vote of the people statewide for any new international bridge to be built, and it has to be approved by the voters in the local community as well. So that's on the ballot. So those are the 6, and then there could be some local ones as well. So I'm going to kind of stop right there just to remind you of the staggering number of offices we've got on the ballot. I'll just mention a couple other things. Parenthetically, we're in Dearborn. It's always interesting to me that Dearborn, which, you know, supposedly has the highest percentage Arab American population in the state, I think until George Duraney was elected as state representative, I don't think they've ever had an Arab American, and I don't think he's Muslim. Am I wrong about that? I don't think he is. You've only got one Muslim in the legislature, only one in history, I think, and her name is Rashida Tlaib, and she's Palestinian. She is from Detroit, southwest Detroit. She just won a primary. The Republicans threw her in to a district with a black female representative named Maureen Stapleton, and they had to face off against each other in a Democratic primary on August 7th, and the district was 85% African American, and Maureen Stapleton is African American, and yet Rashida Tlaib beat her. So, you know, that's something that Muslims can take great pride in. Here you had a Muslim in a very dicey, untenable political situation, and the Muslim came through for whatever reason, whatever. There's a lot more to it than that. But, you know, that's something to be proud of. So you still got a Muslim serving one more term. She's going to be term limited in 2014. She can't run again for the state house. I don't know what might happen with the state senate or whatever. But, you know, over the years, for some reason, the Arab American community and the Muslim population in this state simply has not been as successful in getting people elected at the state level as I would have thought. Interestingly, let's just mention the Jewish population in the state, because they're a small population. They're concentrated in one particular area. I mean, there are other places in the state where they have small pockets of population. But there's one area where they've always been concentrated. That's around Huntington Woods and Royal Oak, in that area. And they have almost every election, as long as I can remember, the representative that comes from that area has been Jewish. I mean, there's just no question about it. They get their own elected for whatever, I don't know whether it's organization, whatever it is. but there's always a Jewish representative from that particular area of Oakland County. And even in the era of term limits, when some of these Jewish representatives have been termed out, a new Jewish candidate emerges. And usually you look at the primaries, and they're all Democratic primaries, heavily Democratic district, heavily Jewish. Almost all the candidates in the primary are Jewish. And the question is, which Jew is going to win the Democratic primary? And once that happens, they're elected in November, and they serve 3 two-year terms now, and it used to be they served longer than that. So I just tell you that demographically. There is, by the way, this year, this is kind of interesting, a Chaldean who has been elected. Obviously not a Muslim. His name is Clint Kesto, and he's up in the Bloomfield Hills area. It's a new district, a wide open district. There were a whole bunch of candidates up there, and I think there were 6. And he won. He's a lawyer, and he had heavy support, I think, from the Chaldean community. His name doesn't really necessarily sound Chaldean. You can't really tell, K-E-S-T-O. But he was elected. So I'm just telling you this to give you some idea of ethnic representation up in Lansing out of 110 seats. It's kind of interesting. And that's it. So I'm not going to go on any longer, and we'll just open it up. And I guess, Mr. Moderator, you want me to sit here and then just... Okay. Thank you.
I think the discussion is going to be good. You should feel free to ask questions addressing what they've spoken of or on other topics that they haven't addressed. Now, I'm the moderator. That means I'm just supposed to moderate and make sure everything is smooth. But I'm also a professor, and I can't resist making some comments of my own, which is not my assignment, but I'm going to do it. But not long ones. I pay a lot of attention to public opinion, and I've noticed something very significant. The Zogby poll has been tracking this, but so have other people. Pew does a really good job on this. There's an increasingly hostile attitude towards Islam and Muslims in this country. And if you look at where that is, for example, a recent poll by Zogby shows that the negative opinions of Muslims over the last decade has increased from 32% negative to 41% negative. If you look at what the shift is, which elements of the population, it's not occurring across the board. If you look at where the shift is occurring, it's mostly an older-younger distinction. Now, I've got to say on behalf of those of us with gray hair that this is not entirely our fault. It's that young people are becoming increasingly more open. It's an astonishing thing. I think when some of us retire from this earth, we're going to leave the country in better hands than we did when we were around. So partially the negative opinions are among older populations. They're partially among whites rather than non-whites, but when you ask, do you personally know a Muslim, what you discover is that non-whites are more likely to know a Muslim than whites are, and that your opinion of Muslims is very sensitive to whether you actually know a Muslim. So there's kind of an advantage that non-white people have because they're more likely to know a Muslim, and that is to their advantage in forming a more balanced perspective. I think we can almost write those two off. Now, I wrote an article once on cultural attitudes towards Muslims and Arabs. This is not cultural. It's partisan. This is not an American pattern. It's not a white pattern. It's a partisan pattern. If you look at where the shift is occurring, it's primarily within the right wing of the Republican Party. Now, there's a reason why that shift is so dramatic. When George Bush was in office, right after September 11th, he was very emphatic, going to the National Mosque in Washington, D.C., and saying, this has nothing to do with Islam. Muslims are not violent people. They're good citizens. As long as he was in office, Republicans kind of kept their opinions to themselves. As soon as he was out of office, you saw it explode. What you see is that among Republicans, particularly the Republicans who identify themselves as conservatives, there is a dramatic increase in negative opinions of Muslims. If you look at what Democrats feel and what independents feel about Muslims, what you see is they're very close together. This is not, you might think, the way we political scientists think is Democrat, Independent, Republican, you can kind of make a line there and you see a stair-step pattern. No, it's not a stair-step pattern. The first two steps are basically at the same level, and then there's a big jump on the Republican side in negative attitudes. Now, when you look further at those Republicans, if you ask them, are you a conservative Republican or a moderate Republican, you see another sub-distinction, that those people who are conservative Republicans have exceptionally negative attitudes towards Muslims. Those people who say they are moderate Republicans, in terms of their political ideology, are much closer to independents and Democrats. That is, they have less hostile attitudes. So I think these are dramatic patterns. I think they're dangerous patterns. If there's a general hostility to Islam in the culture, that's one thing. If there's a hostility to Islam linked to a political movement, that's politically dangerous. That's what I study, and that's what you're seeing in various places in the Islamic world right now, where in a place like Libya, for example, which is the only place probably in the Muslim world where there's a clear majority positive assessment of the United States. They love the Americans, and there you see the American ambassador killed. This is not a Libyan pattern. This is a pattern of extremist groups who have done something. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the Tea Party, which is the center of some of this way of thinking, is violent or anything like that. I don't think they are. But on the other hand, I think you see a partisan base for negative opinions of Islam and of Muslims. And these are different, by the way. Negative opinion of Islam, that's different. Negative opinion of Muslims, these people live here, right? And so if you ask about Islam and American Islam, Muslims and American Muslims, you see dramatic differences. You see big pattern differences. Muslims are a bit crazy. American Muslims, they're less crazy. That's sort of the pattern that you see. And I just want to throw that out as a public opinion contribution to this discussion. But I think you should feel free to raise... Now, what are we going to do with this? Do people have to come up here and ask a question for you to... Because you're taping this, right?
Repeat the question when they ask.
Oh, okay, that's good. You ask it, and I'll stand here and repeat it. That way you don't have to walk up here, okay? So, who would like to ask the first question? Yes?
I'm wondering how you reconcile what you just said about the anti-Muslim feelings among conservative Republicans with the studies finding that historically Muslims have tended to vote Republican, more recently Independent, but not so much Democrat. And then I have a follow-up question.
So the question is, based on what I just said about this negative opinion of Muslims being in the Republican Party, what does that have to do with the fact that that Muslims historically tended to be on the Republican side? And so do you have any thoughts on that? Go ahead.
So I think a couple of things. I mean, one, across the board, the Muslim community tends to be more socially conservative, and so I think that was the affinity to the Republican Party, and definitely also I think a lot of American Muslims would consider themselves more fiscally kind of conservative as well. I think where the movement happened was after the second term of President Bush, where I think a lot of the foreign policy questions became difficult for the Muslim community to reconcile with their support of the Republican Party. In some ways, actually, you know, now with the Republican Party kind of becoming more having elements of this more anti-Muslim sentiment, it's actually unfortunate that Muslims have left the Republican Party, because one wonders if they had stayed engaged with the Republican Party, would we see as much of this as we're seeing now? And so I think the movement to independence has been sort of not quite sure whether the Democratic Party is going to be the new home for American Muslims, and certainly there's been a lot of commentary, whether the Muslim community is going to support President Obama in this election as strongly as it looks like the Muslim community did in the last election. Some of the promises and the policies that he had made, many people feel he hasn't delivered on, and so I think that's still kind of an open question in terms of where the Muslim community is going to go.
Go ahead.
Professor, and both of you, I want to ask a question just based on Fareed's article out there. It indicated that even though Muslims or Arab Americans, that's another question, whether when we say Arab American we automatically mean Muslim. You could be Chaldean, whatever. Coptic Christian or whatever, I don't know. But in 2000, they supported Bush over Gore, and you would agree with that. But his article claimed that by 2004, a majority were supporting Kerry as opposed to Bush. So in other words, this happened really fast after 9/11. And even though people might have had, fairly warm feelings, not warm feelings, but let's put it this way, Republicans didn't make such a big issue with George W. Bush still as president second term. They'd already basically voted against him and voted for Kerry just because of 9/11, right? Anybody have a comment on that? I mean, it's all based on the attack and on what? Patriotism. Why would conservative Republicans on a dime from September 2001, literally in a year, switch from, supporting one party? You see what I'm getting at? What's going on here?
So you're saying, why would the Muslim community change from the
both. I mean, the Muslim community changed, but I gather that the Muslim community probably changed because of what they were hearing or feeling, don't you think, from what the Republicans were saying in that year?
Yeah, I think
not Bush, but the other Republicans.
Yeah, I don't know if Dr. Stockton has a response. I think one of the major policies that was certainly enacted soon after September 11th was the Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act.
Yeah.
So you think that was big because they perceived that as a Republican act by and large, which it was, and so the Muslims would feel threatened by that, and they would desert the Republicans for Kerry in 2004.
And I don't know the exact numbers there, so I'm just
okay,
I'm
no,
kind
but
of just
I mean, it's just kind of
my
interesting.
Yeah.
I'm interested here.
Let me.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reinvaded Afghanistan and Iraq, and a lot of people were also opposed to those policies. So I think it's a
Right.
Combination of the two.
And
Okay.
it wasn't overnight. It wasn't from September 2011 to, January.
Well, that's right. It was 2 years. Yeah, it was 3 years.
3
really.
years,
3
yeah.
years. Okay.
There were, in the year 2000, remember there were 3 candidates running for president, and a plurality.
You're talking about Ralph Nader?
Nader was running, yeah.
Yeah.
And Nader was of Arab heritage, but at the same time he advocated many policies that Arab Americans liked. So the Arab American vote, and that's different from Muslim, because you got people from India and Pakistan, whatever. But the Arab American vote, a strong plurality went for Al Gore, and for George Bush.
For George Bush.
And there were all sorts of reasons for that. I think in terms of the way Americans think, there tends to be a blurring of Arab and Muslim. But at the same time, when you ask people, what do you think about, what is your opinion of Arab Americans, what is your opinion of Muslim Americans, you get slightly like a 10% shift, right? So people are sort of thinking differently in terms of these two groups, even though most people see them as being the same group. I agree with Sally, the Iraq War in particular played a big role. It wasn't the Afghan War, which was different, but the Iraq War was seen as very a war of choice, and it was seen as really an attack on the Arab nation and the Arab world, and I think many people saw that as a betrayal of certain things Bush had promised. Go ahead.
I happen to be a Republican. I was at a meeting when George Bush met with us with the help of John Engler, Spencer Abraham, and the Hyatt Regency. And information out of that room was supposed
What year was that? You mean 2000 when Abraham was running for re-election?
No, when Bush was running.
Well, you mean the first time?
First time.
Yeah, that's 2000.
Correct. Well,
Okay.
Michigan has a little different history. We had a very close relationship with John Engler. You know, particularly I had a good relationship with him. He appointed me as a tourism commissioner, and I served on a community service commission with his wife. And the day before his election, remember, he won by like 10,000 votes. He was with me at a mosque. And that day, the Detroit Free Press had a headline said, Engler trailing 11 points. So, well, Engler told me at least he made some good friends.
Sure, you know, repeat
You know,
it.
he had... Can you hear me?
No, I'll repeat.
We're
Go
going to
ahead.
repeat. Keep talking.
Go ahead.
Keep talking. Go ahead. No, go ahead. We can hear you. Go ahead.
You, give him, go ahead, come and talk into the microphone, because this is Victor Begg, and he is saying he is a Muslim, and he was very close to he's a Republican, and was very close to Engler, and he's telling about some meeting that took place in 2000 during the presidential election and Engler's election campaign.
So I'm going to give you a little bit of history here. Am I on?
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know if you heard the first part of
Yeah,
what
we
what I
heard.
said.
Engler was in the mosque, you said? In the,
Yeah, well, you know, he went through several mosques. And he happened to be the night before at a Rochester Hills Mosque with me. And, you know, he was tired. And I think the polls kind of was depressing, 11 points behind.
Yeah.
So one of the last thing I remember him saying, at least we made some good friends. So and Spencer Abraham came with him. Spence got elected, I think, a year or two before. Engler was running for the governor or afterwards. I forgot.
No.
Right.
Abraham was elected in '94.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Abraham was the chair of the Republican Party at that point, I think.
No, not in 2000, no.
Not in 2000.
Well, look, if you're talking about 2000, Abraham was running for his second term, okay? He had been in the Senate for 6 years. Engler had already been governor for 10 years.
Oh, well, let's put that aside.
Okay.
I don't know why I mentioned Spence.
All right.
So anyways, you know, we had a very close relationship with the Republican Party.
Right.
And I used to attend, and some other members I know, Dr. Ghulam Khadir is here. I remember him at the Mackinac. We used to attend the Republican conventions. And then we had developed fairly good relationships. So, and we promoted Engler, and some of the things he did for us, you know, we were all Republicans at that point. So the next time around, when the Bush was running for election, I got to refresh my memory here again.
You know, we're getting kind of mixed up here. I think you're talking about 1990, aren't you? You're talking
First
about when
time
Engler was first running, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's 22 years ago.
So that was the first
1990.
time.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think it was his third term.
Yeah, and
when
you're
in
right.
2000.
Abraham was still chairman at that
Right.
time. Yeah.
The 2000 when it was his third term was ending, I believe.
And you're talking about Bush the father, H.W. Bush, right? You're not talking
Bush,
about George.
George W.
You're talking about George?
George W. when he came to Hyatt Regency and met with us. And you're right, the Iraqi problem was on our minds, but one of the things Bush said at that meeting, that once he gets elected, he will bring peace to Iraq. That was privately said.
Okay.
And profiling was a big deal at that time, so if you remember in the debate with Al Gore, he mentioned that. So you see, that kind of drove our community crazy, and they all supported Republicans.
Yeah.
So that's what happened, but then 2001, 9/11 attacks came, and on that day, some of us were in Washington, D.C., were supposed to meet Bush. That was supposedly the christening of the Muslim community in the Bush, and, you know, wrong metaphor, but that's what it was, and it got canceled. And from that point, everything was downhill. So 9/11 made a profound difference, and what Professor Stockton said, I think the image of the community, to me at this point, is very important for the Muslim community to work on. Because everything is political, as you know, unless we get into public relations. You know, I'm a senior advisor for Michigan Community Council, and that's what I tell my community. Let's focus on, you know, interfaith work, community work with the media, and everything goes on in the Middle East makes it even worse for us.
Well, how do you feel personally? Do you feel that you personally were betrayed by Bush? I mean, are you alienated now from the Republican Party personally? Or
No, I'm still involved with the Republican Party. I think we got to get more involved with the Republican Party, and which is, you know,
you may be the last man standing. Huh?
It could be, you know. we need our next generation. We need our next generation getting more involved. Some of us are getting tired, you know, and our next generation doesn't want to be Republican for some reason.
Well, you just cited the reasons, I think.
Yes, in the back. And then John Smith will be next.
For the record, most Arab Americans are not Muslim privileged. Second, the shift that you're talking about in 2000 was based on foreign policies. Because in 2000, it came down to Florida. Nearly 3,000 votes in Florida, Arab American votes, went to Bush solely based on foreign policy and the Arabs were out. And the Bush won Florida by less than 1,000 votes. That means technically, and without intention, the Arab vote gave Bush the presidency. And then the events that led to that, which he didn't deliver on the Arab-Israeli conflict, made people change their minds.
Yeah.
So this, you know, from just political protection, historical point of view, is what happened. The other thing is that, with all due respect to our friend here, most Muslim Republicans are confused between being socially conservative and politically conservative. And if they would read the history of the Republican Party, they would change their mind. And I'm not a Democrat. I'm just, you know, mentioning that from studying the background.
So the comment was that just for the audience on television, the comment was that the foreign policy was a big factor in the year 2000. In the state of Florida, which Bush carried by 3,000 votes, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was an issue, and I think myself that George the son got a lot of credibility from his father's good efforts in that direction, and many people thought he would be pursuing the same sort of policies, and they were very profoundly disappointed after that. Now, do either of our speakers want to comment on that? Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to repeat the other thing you said, which I think is important, that the majority of Arab Americans in the U.S. are Christian and not Muslim. So I wanted to make sure that was.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
The follow-up I had was whether anybody has closely assessed the Dearborn vote since 2000 in federal elections as for the Arab and/or Muslim communities' support of the Democratic candidates.
The question has to do with whether there's any insight into how Arabs and Muslims in Dearborn particularly are voting on presidential elections, and I'll bet Bill has some thoughts on that.
I actually have not seen figures since 2000 on how that vote has gone. All I've seen are general figures on who carried Dearborn overall, the whole population. But breaking it down, Arab American versus non-Arab American, I have not seen that. I mean, I know it exists, but I haven't seen it. Have you?
I was going to say, I think the second panel will get, maybe not specifically to that question, but looking a bit more at the details of sort of the trends in different minority communities. So we might have someone on that panel who would be able to give us a little more insight.
Yes.
For your chart that indicated first and second and third generation, did it take into account new citizenship? Sort of looking at participation based on
The question is whether the data chart, which we saw during Shireen's presentation, which described first, second, and third generation, did that take into account citizenship and the process of becoming a citizen?
Yeah, so I think that's where, again, sort of the longer you're a citizen and your children are then obviously are citizens as well, that sort of the more generations you have in the country, the more politically active you're going to see. And so I think that's definitely accounted for in that data as well.
In the back.
A couple of comments, observations that I have made. One day, me and my chief of staff were going on a boat ride, and we're just talking about the kids, saying how bad they're going to be, and he said, you know what, our kids are okay, and you and me were screwed up, but our heart is over there, we're physically here, and I think that that's the conflict that we have. The other thing is the friendship, the issue of friendship. Where I come from, if I have a friend, I'm going to stand by that friend no matter what, whether that friend is wrong or right. And over here, it's really politics. You really don't have a friend. If you somehow the other are on the wrong side, then you really don't vote. And what do you say to the politician who only aim is that you want to be elected or re-elected, and where the votes are coming from or where the money is coming from? If you don't have the votes, if you don't have the money, you can forget about it. They are not going to vote. I think the problem with the Muslims is that we vote for the Republican Party, we vote for the Democratic Party, and anybody who promises that they're never going to deliver. We want to vote with them, but at the same time, we don't take a step ourselves. Why don't we run for election ourselves? What's wrong with us? I think that as long as we just keep on looking for the other, that somebody is going to represent us, it's not going to happen.
The comment was that the person says that he was talking to one of his friends about their kids, and maybe the kids were not going to turn out right. And his friend said to him, no, you and I are the ones that are not turning out right because our heart is still back in the home country, whereas our kids are adapting, and that's a positive sign. The second point he made was that in his home country, when you have a friend, you stick with that friend and you back them up whatever they have. But in American politics, politicians will often make a promise which they have no intention. They just want to get elected, and people are cynical about that. I got to say, you don't have to be Muslim to be cynical about that. But so what do we have?
Sorry, a couple of comments. One is I think the sort of division in immigrant communities is something that was definitely shown in the report. So again, that idea of the more generations here in this country, the more politically active, and also the example of the African American community in this country that has been incredibly successful in gaining office at many different levels. I mean, certainly, obviously, in our national, federal level, we have 2 Muslim American members of Congress who are both from the African American community. So I think we have a lot to learn from that. And I think on that note, quite honestly, the Muslim community is too small and too disengaged right now to gain as many political offices as we may want. And so that's why we need to work with others who share our concerns, and we need to build real partnerships. We need to work with those political officials who might be from other minority groups, or work with coalitions that are interfaith groups who might share some of the same concerns, because until we start to make our issues bigger than just about our community, we're never going to win on these topics. So I think that's a lot of what we're going to focus on in the second panel, is that there are a lot of areas of commonality in terms of the issues that many marginalized communities face, and I think that's going to be our strategy. I mean, one day, inshallah, we'll have the voting power and the savvy to be able to win more elections on our own, but until then, we need to find other partners and allies to get the work done that we want to see happen.
Relationship with the Republican Party and the Muslim community. I'm not saying that just because I'm Republican. I live in Oakland County, and I was elected to my school board. I was endorsed by the Bloomfield Hills Republican Club. Practically everyone seems to be Republican there, and they endorsed me, and knowing that I'm very active, and I write op-eds in the newspapers, and I'm quite vocal Muslim activist. However, they knew me. And they had no problem endorsing, and I think with everyone I know, in Oakland County, whether it's Brooks, our sheriff, Bouchard. I mean, see, these are the people that we know. And actually, I mentioned to Brooks one time that I'm getting a little discouraged by all this negativity that comes out, and his answer was, so am I. So, I mean, the people feel that there is a problem with, if you want to call it, the right wing of the Republican Party. But most of Republicans, I find them moderate. You know, we might have some people like Ajima way up. And that, too, I think it's politically motivated more than anything else. That's my comment.
I just mentioned one thing, and that is Congressman Ellison in Minnesota, right? He's one of the two. He was born in Detroit. He's a Muslim, but he didn't get elected from Michigan. He had to go to Minnesota and get elected as a Muslim. So whatever. But he is originally from Detroit.
Sally, go ahead, and we'll get you next.
So you mentioned that you think it's curious that Dearborn doesn't have more officials at the state level who represent the ethnicity of the Arab community. But I guess I want to ask, sort of turn that around a little bit and say maybe that's actually not a sign that they're not active or they're not being successful. Maybe it's true that they've got candidates who aren't from their ethnicity who really respond well to the needs and interests of their community and take their interests into consideration. Like the mayor of Dearborn also isn't Arab, and he was really overwhelmingly supported by the Arab community. So I just would like to hear you comment on that.
Let me repeat the question. Sally Howell said that maybe the fact that there are not Arabs or Muslims in the state legislature from Dearborn is not entirely a bad thing, because there are many non-Muslim, non-Arab candidates who are very responsive to the community, and this is actually a positive thing that you're getting non-Arabs cooperating with Arabs and Muslims. So Bill Bellard had a comment.
Well, the only other thing I'd say, and maybe it gets back to this business about Republican versus Democrat, and there's a lot of this. It's fascinating. You asked the question, what are the returns over the last decade? Remember Gary Warrenchuk? He was a Republican, and he was not Arab American, but he had to appeal to the Arab American population to get elected as a Republican in Dearborn. And yet, at the time he was elected, I know the Republicans up in Lansing always considered that Dearborn was winnable. I mean, they had lost it for a number of years. I mean, Agnes Dobronsky, remember her? She's still around. She's feisty as ever. She's retired now from politics, but I mean, even with her in the legislature from Dearborn, a Democrat, the Republicans always thought, you know, we got a shot here. We can win. Runco, remember him, Bill Runco? So the Republicans were close, but I noticed in about the last half dozen years, I think they kind of pretty much written Dearborn off. I think they don't think they can win here anymore. And I know the district lines have been slightly changed through reapportionment, but that hasn't really made that much difference. So I think probably there has been a shift in the Arab American population here that has made it even tougher on the Republicans, who were always the minority party here. But every once in a while, a Runco or a Warrenchuk could sneak in under the right circumstances. If he was a strong campaigner and made an appeal to Arab Americans, he could get elected. But now I'm thinking that really what's been happening, without having actually seen the statistics, it's going south for the Republicans in Dearborn. And it's just almost impossible for them to probably win now. And all I was saying earlier, I was just trying to point out that, you know, it would be nice to get, you know, Arab Americans elected to the legislature, to get Muslims. I mean, you'd like to be able to say, yeah, we've got Representative Joe Blow here, and boy, he really is good dealing with the Arab American. Well, that's fine. But after 10, 20, 30 years of that, wouldn't it be nice to give Abdullah Smith be the guy who gets up to Lansing and gets elected? I think so, you know.
I was going to have you next, but Ishmael Ahmed is knowledgeable about Dearborn, and he's probably going to respond specifically to this, so I'm going to let you come next, if that's okay.
Can I just sit here and be neutral? But
Would you like to take a microphone so I don't have to repeat this?
I've tried to be neutral because I have to host the next panel, but I just want to say a couple things. One, I do watch the numbers, not only in Dearborn, but surrounding numbers, and who gets elected and how often and so forth. And the majority vote, and that includes when Spencer Abraham ran, when people split the ticket, of Arab Americans has been growingly Democratic and overwhelmingly Democratic in the last period. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I won't go into. But also, I think this thing about not having enough elected officials, I've seen a growing of elected officials. The person who is the representative for Dearborn is the Arab American. There are 3 or 4 council members who are Arab American. There is a school board member who is Arab American. And on the national level, more Arab Americans and Muslims were represented in the Democratic Party convention than any time in history, including from this state. And I think there is almost a quota to assure at least one Arab American is on the Democratic Party slate every single time. In fact, there is a
Brian Masalam
this
year.
Brian this time,
Yeah.
and before that Dennis Deno, and going back at least 4 elections. When a governor comes into office, they look around to see if there's at least one department head that makes sense. Now, so I think that there is real palpable progress, both in the Arab American community and the Muslim community. And I think, you know, the positioning of people like Victor and others in the Republican Party is important. I think that we have to be not a single party community. I'm saying that as vice chair of the Democratic Party. And so, you know, I would encourage, you know, continued work and organization in that party as well.
Let me make a comment, and then I'll take a question from the floor. I think there's a danger of talking about having community representatives, because usually when people say, let's get our community together and nominate someone, they nominate the wrong person. Because if you're there to represent your community's interests, you're just not going to be able to carry the vote of people outside your community who are going to think you're not running their interests. And I remember a decade ago when we had a visiting delegation from the Middle East of journalists and other people. And I said to them, I was talking to them about Arab American issues, and I said to them, in the state of Michigan, in the last few years, we have had in the United States Senate a Jew and an Arab. Both come from very small communities numerically. Both were elected because they represented the interests of the state and their voters, not because if they had run on the interests of their community, they would never have been elected. And so I've seen the cases where people run on behalf of the Arabs or on behalf of this, and they sink in the swamps. There's no future in that kind of a thing. Now, you've been very patient at wanting to make a comment. Thank you.
The Obama administration has been aggressively pushing abortion as a fundamental human right that should be paid for by the government if necessary, both domestically and around the world, including in predominantly Catholic and Muslim nations. This is cultural imperialism at its worst, and yet I get the impression it isn't even on the radar screen of the Arab American and Muslim American communities. Is that true, and how much of an impact, how important is that to them?
So the question is that the Obama administration is supportive of abortion, and is this having any impact? It appears that Muslims and Arabs are not paying attention to this issue. Is that impression correct?
I don't know for sure sort of how it ranks in terms of the issues that Arab and Muslim communities are making their decisions on. My hope is that people are looking at candidates holistically, but I think that it's very clear, again, that the Arab, at least in our study, the Muslim community is quite socially conservative, and so tends to be more pro-life than pro-choice.
Well, then they ought to be really upset with what President Obama's doing. You're implying they're not upset, seemingly.
I don't hear about it one way or the other.
On the Zogby polls, it always comes in way after the economy has.
Yeah.
It is an issue that people care about, but it's like ranked 8th or 9th on the list.
Of the.
Not the top
Right, so just to repeat that, it's not, the abortion issue for the Arab and Muslim communities doesn't rank in the top few questions in terms of the issues that they're most concerned with.
Yeah, slightly off point. I'll just mention here about diminishing Republican strength in Dearborn. Maybe the best testimony was Suzanne Serini, right? I mean, here she was, a Republican, Arab American on the Dearborn City Council, running in 2010, which is a huge Republican wave year. She got blitzed by Delaney, right? So that kind of sums it up right there. You know, and they're not, I don't think the issue, what you're saying, I think is valid. It's a real question, but.
They were both pro-life as far as I know.
They probably were. No, I'm not saying that was an issue in their race. But I'm just saying overall, I just think the Democrats have gone so far in that direction for other reasons that that issue is buried way down, as she said, beneath all these others, just submerged.
We got time for a few more questions. Yes.
I've heard that in Washington, the group that's the ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, you talk about strategies in terms of what goes on locally in local legislatures, that they've been responsible for pushing initiatives and laws, legislative efforts. And the reason I mention it is because I heard that they also have very influenced anti-immigrant legislation in Arizona and Alabama and other states. Are you aware of this? Or is there any?
Do you want to repeat the question? Do you want to repeat the question?
No, I don't. Go ahead. I don't have a question. I don't have a comment.
You don't want.
So
So they can pick it up.
oh, sorry. You know what? I lost track of the question. I'm very sorry. Go ahead. You go ahead and respond. Summarize the question.
Okay, he asked about the American Legislative Exchange Council. Okay, ALEC it's called. That's the acronym, based in Washington, D.C. They're a very conservative organization, back Republican candidates. You're asking whether or not they're instrumental in pushing anti-immigrant and maybe stuff that's inimical to Arab American interests? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. You know, look, they're a right-wing conservative legislative organization, and they kind of back the whole shooting match, probably including what you're talking about. I don't think that's that high in their list of priorities, frankly. I think it's more fiscal stuff that they're interested in most of the time. But there's no denying they've probably been instrumental in pushing that, yeah.
Yes.
Regarding the abortion issue, I'm not a scholar in that aspect anyway, but I think my feeling is that the Muslims are not as fanatic. These are personal issues. They say everybody has to answer to whoever their God is. That is the reason they don't, privately they're anti-abortion, but when they give public sex, that's what they like.
The speaker said that he thinks most Muslims are probably pro-life, but this is not a public issue for them. They have other priorities. Who hasn't spoken? Who hasn't had a question? Anybody have an additional question? Okay, we're just about out of time, and I think I'll thank all of you. It's been a very productive exchange, and thank you so much.
We'll invite the next